DeFi by Design, where we talk all things blockchain and cryptocurrency while striving to educate, empower, and enrich.
What's going on, guys? Welcome back to episode 95 of the DeFi by Design podcast. Here today with our boy Rob as well as Arjun from Connext, and we're going to be talking about the multi-chain world. Seen a lot of activity flourishing on rollups as of recently, and seeing a bunch of new chains come out, as well as some of the kind of older alternative layer ones still stay alive. So it's been a really interesting time in the kind of world of which chain do I call my home. I've had a lot of fun on rollups recently, had a lot of profitable opportunities, and the same can be said about a lot of different other homes. So today we're going to be talking about using Connext to, travel from one home to another and how that looks, some of the vision. And yeah, I'm here with Rob. Rob, it's been a little while since a pod, but we're back in action. How you doing?
Yes, sir. Good morning. Doing well. Pleasure to be on today. We talk a lot about this analogy, or at least we have talked about it in the past, where like the chains are like islands or cities, and then bridges are like the roads between those cities that people could travel and transfer from one home to another. And Connext provides that infrastructure to travel between cities. So, I think conceptually everyone kind of understands like how to travel. Bridge UX is one of the better user experiences that is on the ecosystem right now. Technically, like we've seen some kind of we've seen some exploits, right? So I'm interested to hear how Connext protects against those. And then kind of what the thesis is in the future for multi-chain. It's something that kind of started slowly and then suddenly. Now there's several chains. There was just one or two early on, and I think that trend will continue as we have sharding, more chains pop up. We'll continue to have more and more multi-chain universe, and bridging and infrastructure between those chains becomes even more important. So Arjun, it's a pleasure to have you on today. Maybe you could start about how you got into blockchain, and then we can kind of let the story unfold on how you got started with Connext.
Yeah, for sure. First of all, thank you guys so much for having me here. It's great to be on this podcast and great to chat with everybody about it. How did I get into crypto? I originally had a background in physics, like theoretical physics. I was planning to kind of pursue academia in that direction, and then realized that I wanted to have be able to work on something that had more meaningful impact in my own lifetime to a larger number of people. And at the time, I was really interested in this is back in 2016. I was really interested in public goods, and I'd had a lot of exposure to peer-to-peer protocols in the early torrenting days. But I'd never really been that interested in Bitcoin because I was never very interested in money and finance. And that was when I came across Ethereum just at a hackathon. And I think that was kind of when things clicked for me, where I was like, okay, we have all of these very deep societal issues around, corporate monopolization or, sovereign effective monopolization, right? Large organizations, both corporate or government related, that are where the desires of their constituents, so the individual people in a population, don't really match well to what ends up happening at the government level. And to me, it always felt like, okay, what we're missing is a third option. Something where you're not having to pick between some mega corporation or some authoritarian government. You get to pick some option that is actually legitimately democratized, some option where individual people have the agency and authority to make decisions in some system. And the best example of a digital, globally accessible public good that I'd kind of come across up until that point was the internet. And so when I first encountered Ethereum, again, 2016-ish, it blew my mind, because in my mind, I was like, this is the platform that allows us to basically expand on the key thing that the internet pioneered, which was create a globally accessible network for communication, to now create other kinds of public goods that let us do more interesting and more powerful things. Things like coordinating with each other on a local or global scale, and doing that in a cheap way that is also provably fair. Things like being able to give access to financial infrastructure, things like being able to put like social graphs and things like that on chain. It have those be kind of available to everybody, so that you don't have monopolization happening around like things like Facebook. Very abstract idea. I smoked a lot of weed at the time, so still do, but it was very much a like early phase where I think at the time in 2016, most people who were in the space were still kind of thinking about these very, very abstract concepts from a very deep philosophical level. And so it's kind of cool to see how things have progressed since then. In 2017, I started wanting to become really more deeply involved in the space. I started a couple of projects. I like helped kind of kick off a couple of like early infrastructure things in the space, and then eventually realized that there was this need to build tooling that allowed users to interact with Ethereum more easily. This was kind of second half of 2017 when the ICO boom was starting to pick up, and started Connext with the initial idea of let's find a way to make it very, very easy for people to interact with dApps. And pretty quickly, it became very obvious that at the time, it was completely impossible for anybody to interact with any dApps because Ethereum just didn't scale at all. The prospect of like, I need to pay $70, $80 to buy a $10 ticket, like NFT ticket, was obviously ridiculous. And a lot of the early projects that we were working with at the time had exactly that problem. We couldn't even build any sort of tooling or products for them until they solved the scalability issue. And so we became one of the first projects doing R&D on L2s. We actually built one of the first L2s in the space on Ethereum for a project called SpankChain, which is an adult payment processor / campsite platform. They were one of the only projects with any traction, actually, back in 2017, 2018. And we built a state channel network, a conditional payment platform that they used at the time to do tips for Camstars and then also payments. Over the course of the next like 2 to 3 years, we continued doing a lot of R&D with the broader L2 ecosystem. Most of the people that were in that ecosystem, or at least the researchers that are working that ecosystem, have now gone on to create most of the rollups and chains that we know of today. So that included, the founders of Matic, which became Polygon, obviously. That included the people in Plasma Group, which eventually became Optimism. That included the founders of Arbitrum, or Off-Chain Labs, which obviously developed Arbitrum. And through the course of that, we realized that there was this actually very, very interesting problem that people weren't thinking about a lot, which was in a world where there end up being multiple different layer 2 options, how do you actually, once again, abstract away the complexity for users to have to interact with many of them? We were kind of very early to this thought process, and we were very lucky in that we turned out to be quite correct. So in 2020, we started kind of playing around with this idea of doing, transfers between rollups without introducing trust. And in 2021, the whole multi-chain ecosystem exploded. And all of a sudden, this became like a huge and very pressing need. That's kind of a 0 to 100 of like how we got here. Where we're going is, even from 2021, our key belief has been in the same way. So today, when you use the internet, you don't really need to think about, you use an application. You don't really need to think about like what's going on behind that application. As a user, if you go and interact with YouTube, you don't have to think about how YouTube is pulling data from APIs all over the world, or how it's interacting with like Google's distributed database infrastructure in the background. You're just using an app. And we think that dApps kind of need to get to the same place. Like the whole concept of I'm on Optimism and my funds are here, and I need to go and use this application running on Polygon, so I need to bridge over there to use it. That notion is just like bizarre to anybody that's not in the space, right? It's like very Web 1 like, where in like the early Web 1 days, you were like, I'm connected to my local college network, and I need to use the internetwork to connect to this other network somewhere else, and I have to like manually plug in that other network's like routing address so that way I can get there, and then I can interact with their stuff. Like that's kind of where we are right now. And I think the way that we get there is by allowing for application developers to have tooling that, in the same way that the internet works today, interact with resources that live on multiple chains. Resources meaning data, funds, state, users, that live on multiple chains all at once, without having to really think about it. So in the same way that you use YouTube today, allowing you to interact with, I don't know, Aave in a way where Aave is just in the background routing your LP deposit to whichever pool is providing the best rate, rather than you having to specifically say, I want this to go to Optimism, I want this to go to Polygon. And I think just kind of as a final note there, this really bakes into, Rob, what you were saying, which is just we are heading towards a world with many more chains. That's not going away. Like Connext, our fundamental thesis and the thing that we're leaning into is that there will be 1,000 rollups in the next year and a half. And when that happens, as a user, are you going to know the difference between Arbitrum 1, Arbitrum 2, Arbitrum Nova, et cetera, et cetera? No, you're not going to care. You're just going to say, I want to use an app. That's it.
Yeah, you're going to want deep liquidity and fast throughput and low slippage, low fees, and just be able to interact. And it goes even further into the idea of onboarding people who aren't as technically savvy, who want to use bridges, and who really may not care as much per se, or may not be as deep in the weeds on the technical side. It again just expands the vision that you have of multiple chains, hundreds of chains, and basically obfuscating a lot of the processes that we, let's call us DeFi power users, do on a daily or weekly basis into a more just fluid ecosystem. Kind of makes me sad, man. It's like one day there's going to be no hard work involved. It's just going to be all so easy and seamless.
Yeah, that's when all the alpha dries up.
Exactly. No, precisely.
And another part that's a little bit sad is it kind of loses its home feeling, because you're not really aware of what chain you're actually on. Maybe the community transcends more into just kind of the group chats you're in, and not necessarily the actual chains, but more of the brand recognition would be on the actual protocol, the decentralized application rather than the chain.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, I think for what it's worth, I think what we're probably going to start seeing. So right now, the main end user facing application is investment, right? That's there really are very few things that exist in the space that are getting end user traction that are not finance oriented or some sort of financial upside oriented. And it's just kind of the nature of where the space is right now, is people believe in crypto, and so they want to get involved. And if you're not a developer that is capable of building things, the way that you're getting involved is by investing in things. Or if you're not in a position where you can go and join a company to work on things. But I think
Lens is probably the only one.
Yeah. But even with Lens, right? I think the vast majority of people that are using Lens are probably existing crypto users that are it's providing a use case that is not there's a ton of others too, that are providing use cases that are not, perhaps not financial appreciation oriented, but they're still targeting the same core user group. And I think the reason for that is if you really think about it, right? What is the end user use case for cloud? There isn't one, right? Cloud computing as an industry, the end user facing use case, the use case was, let's go and integrate into a bunch of infrastructure that allows people to build more powerful web applications, which can then themselves interact with end users. And I think that that's something that I think that's kind of the weird place that we exist right now, is we have a lot of these incorrect signals from the market which say, oh, well, users actually care about the brands of the chain, but really they only care insofar as they're investors, and then developers care about the brands of the chain and the communities and stuff like that. But ultimately, some end user that's out there that doesn't really care about crypto at all and just wants to use an app, they're only ever going to care about the app. That's never going to change.
Yeah, that's interesting. That takes the idea of the fat protocol thesis, or the layer one or the base layer thesis, and kind of reverses it on its head as far as just powerful apps that will scale. Because if you think about it, it's in the reference that you make with the cloud, there's tons of different apps on the internet, from Facebook all the way to various softwares, things like this, and each user doesn't think about Internet Explorer or Firefox or Brave. It's more of I'm going on Instagram, or I'm going on Telegram, right? So yeah, I think what I see Connext providing for the ecosystem is a means of allowing end users to use whatever protocol or app that they choose without necessarily minding where it is only for whatever use case that they have. So if it's a financial one, right, they can use the app in the place where they can have the biggest gain potential or best risk to reward ratio or kind of highest yield, right? If it's a community based one where the largest communities are, NFTs, kind of all a similar process of thought where bridges like Connext are just basically a pathway. But I still find that in the current stage of the market, there are, I think, users that are currently here, which is obviously nothing compared to 2021 and also nothing compared to, like, say, 5 years out. I think they still have a home. Like, there's still 3 to 4 chains that they use on a daily or weekly basis. All right, they'll trade on GMX on one chain, they'll use Aave on one, they'll buy NFTs on one, they'll use a specific yield app on another, they'll trade options potentially on one. So, I think that there's still something to be said about users finding their own homes. And again, Connext just allows them to kind of test out different basically areas to live. If you think about Ethereum as a digital nation state, and then kind of plant their roots, how they like.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that that's kind of the big sort of asterisk here is like we are still at least a half a decade away, if not longer, to getting to the point where this stuff is like fully abstracted. And it's going to be, I mean, I think everybody always just like grossly underestimates how long infrastructure takes to build and how long some of this lower level stuff takes. Kind of getting back to your point, like this is part of the reason why, like, this is part of what this whole space unlocks, right? It makes it very easy to go and build applications. Like you can go and fork and deploy an application in minutes now, rather than having to like take like months like you used to, both in this space and out of this space. But then the flip side of that is like the infrastructure itself needs to be so stable, it needs to move at a slow enough pace, it needs to be conservative enough that it can then support that level of innovation. And so I really do kind of firmly believe, we're still a ways out. It's a good like directional indicator for what we should be trying to lean into and trying to find ways to continue to like abstract away chains. But fundamentally, it's not something that's gonna happen overnight. There's gonna be like some awkward in between steps.
Yeah.
And we have, for example, some things that we'll be rolling out soon, that allow like tooling that allows for applications to enable their infrastructure to be interacted with from any chain, so that they, as an application, you don't have to be like, oh, I can only target users from my chain. I can, you're massively broadening your market. But again, like there's still going to be some gotchas where users are going to be like, until users have like a wallet experience that actually supports all of the chains, they're going to be like, oh, well, my funds transferred across chains to interact with this app, and now I'm entered into like a position on this chain, but like how do I actually track that position on that chain? Well, now you have to go and perhaps use something like DeBank or Zapper instead to do that, rather than your own wallet. So it's going to be like kind of incremental progress.
Yeah, it's slow and steady. And I think account abstraction is something that's big, that's happening, which for those listeners who are still a little on the edge, because it's kind of confusing. I'm going to do a video about it this week, but effectively think of your MetaMask wallet as like almost like a wallet in your pocket, and then think of an account abstraction, like a smart contract wallet, as like a smartphone, like a Venmo. So I mean, it's a little bit more advanced than that, but that's the kind of level of step that I think that will take for user experience, as well as basically onboarding more people to the experience. And then, yeah, like you said, just kind of more of that front-facing technology takes longer to build than just forking Synthetics' code and dropping a new app or a new kind of pool or something like that. But I'm curious, kind of shifting gears here, unless Rob's got something super pressing.
Well, I've got one more, just kind of like similar, as far as why, Arjun, why you think the complexity of the user experience is causing the industry to only build financial applications?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because right now, blockchains and this space don't scale enough to actually build anything else. Because if you think about it, right, like we're basically operating like a fucking TI-83 calculator right now. We're not like the kind of code that you're writing on chain, like it's like 600 lines of Solidity code that you're deploying, and it's costing you like $10 per interaction to use. That's never going to work for any real application, right? For any like real use case that goes beyond beyond something that's like just fundamental, very basic, very simple public good. I think that the broader idea here is like, you want to allow people to, like, this industry allows people to build these like very, very sophisticated public goods eventually. And in order for those things to be fully credibly neutral public goods, they need to not, eventually they need to work towards not actually having any centralized dependencies at all. So that means, being deployed on chain, having the compute run on chain, having storage run on chain, even having the UIs be served from chain. So you don't have this situation where like a UI gets shut down and so now nobody can interact with the app anymore. Until we get there, like we're going to get there. In fact, the cross-chain stuff is probably going to be what gets us there. Like the combination of being able to interact between chains and being able to deploy many application-specific rollups very quickly that can have their own kind of parameters around, hey, this one's better for compute, this one's better for storage, etc. So the combination of those two things is going to make it so that you can have these like full stack decentralized applications. But until we get there, like we're sort of just we're basically just kind of like hacking it with certain things that we know can provide value today, and we know can like be credibly neutral, that are quite basic. And like at this stage, it's still very, very simple stuff.
Yeah, makes sense. Like lack of scalability prevents these full scale applications that serve use cases beyond financial ones.
Exactly. Like I think eventually, and pretty soon, I think what we're going to start seeing as this space now, I mean, we have the scalability now with rollups and with cross-chain communication, we can actually do this today. What we're going to start seeing is stuff like decentralized Wikipedia with like legitimate incentives for like high quality editing, right? We're going to start seeing, basically any situation where you're like, okay, there's this thing that exists as a public good and that everybody interacts with that is, that should be globally accessible and shouldn't be owned by any singular company. You can probably put on chain and it could be quite a useful thing. So things like Google search, for example, right? You can eventually, I mean, this one's a little bit further away, but you could eventually have like an on-chain map of the internet and allow people to search, like do a graph traversal through that map. And that becomes a replacement for Google, just like the search aspect of Google. And again, credibly neutral on-chain public good.
Yeah, and bring AI into the mix, and then things get really weird.
Yeah.
Because like AI is replacing search, and you could bring AI like onto a blockchain and make it credibly neutral, and I guess people could maybe like the incentives, you could benefit from training it or using it somehow.
Yeah, exactly. Any situation where you're like, I mean, I've tweeted about this once, but I think the playbook here is really simple. It's like, if once the technology in this space gets to the point where it's mature, basically it's going to be like one of my friends, Amin, founder of SpankChain, and has done a bunch of other stuff in the space as well, and we've collaborated quite a bit. But he I love his terminology for what this space will eventually get to, which is a decentralization laser beam. You're basically just going to be able to play this repeatable playbook, which is going to be look for Web2 monopolies. Any Web2 monopoly you find, figure out what the means of production is for that monopoly. So what is the thing that they're actually building a moat around, and decentralize that. So like Facebook, it's their social graph, decentralize that into Lens. Google, it's the search graph, decentralize that into like an on-chain map of the internet.
Shoot the decentralization laser beam right at the Web2 monopoly.
Yeah, it's gonna be really cool if it works.
Yeah, it's super solid.
Yeah,
AI is crazy.
Yeah, AI will be another. I mean, we're starting to see the first monopoly there. But yeah, I mean, the peer-to-peer nature of it then just paves the way for incentives to be built around the moat. And then, like, I'm almost glad that we have as an industry, we have experience working in DAOs that are crafting incentives at a scale for these financially based apps, which require like pretty significant incentives, sophisticated incentives, before we start shooting this laser beam at like Web2 monopolies, because we're going to have like pretty sophisticated incentive structures to overtake, those Web2 monopolies or compete with them.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
agreed.
This is a super bear market podcast, from the industry not being prepared and mature enough to we're all in this together.
Yeah, I have the max amount of hopium in the bear, and like in the bull, I get so like if we do this podcast again in the next bull market, you're gonna see me be like the most jaded, crankiest old man in the space.
I don't blame you. I mean, all the bad stuff happens towards the tail end of the bull, all the hacks, the exploits, and the drama and the crazy gains and just the absolute garbage. But yeah, it always comes and goes. And I mean, yeah, on the topic of kind of the end of the bull and kind of the jadedness, I think a lot of people in the industry watching this as well who've experienced it in some sort are somewhat jaded from bridges because of the amount of exploits. I know Vitalik wrote an article about it way back when, and different cross-chain, multi-chain. It's not a cross-chain world; it's a multi-chain, or vice versa. And I'm just curious from a more technical and security perspective, what you guys have learned from the let's just say the failed or the bridges that have had some issues, and what your vision and outlook and model kind of is for security for Connext.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's good that you, first of all, great transition into this because it is a really important topic, and you're totally right. Like I think everybody is concerned about this and scared about this because it is a big problem for the space. I think bridges are, and like cross-chain communication is like the first. It's a primitive that is at the same level as blockchains themselves, right? Fundamentally, it's like you have blockchains and then you have the substrate that connects them. It's something that people have been thinking about for literally decades now, and there really hasn't like it's been thought about a lot, it's been theorized a lot, but there hasn't been a lot of like practical application until recently because the demand just wasn't there yet. But of course, everybody was like, yes, it's going to get there eventually. And arguably, this is also why rollups exist. Like rollups are explicitly a solution to this problem, where like back in 2017, 2018, everybody was like, okay, how can we allow for two chains to communicate with each other, Ethereum and a sidechain, but do it in a way where there's no possible way for that sidechain to actually like rug its users. And the only way to do that was to have the sidechain explicitly rely on Ethereum for ordering of transactions and for data availability, which then became a rollup. It was then called a rollup. And so we've been kind of circling around this problem for a very, very long time. I think it's not surprising that given where the market was, given how suddenly this became a problem, like a user problem and not just a theoretical problem, how many hacks we've had. Like I think this is like, when we were doing this with rollups, there was like several years before people even began using rollups where we had time to like iterate on designs and think about like what is the best kind of way for this to work. And by the point at which the first rollup started to be developed, rollups as a construction were finalized. That was not true of bridges. In fact, when bridges started to become popular in like early 2021 and started to be used, nobody really understood how they worked at all, and there was just a myriad of different ways to do it, and the vast majority of the ways that it was being done were just fully custodial. It was basically like someone running either a single server or running like a multi-sig and relaying transactions between chains using that, and like not understanding why that's not good enough, and why that's actually problematic, not just for users, but also just for this ecosystem more broadly. I think now the level of sophistication is improving, which is good. Being in a bear market where the hype is lower, where people actually have time to build and aren't just trying to like capture as much value as possible is really, really important. And I think a big part of that is also that we, as Connext, and I think more generally the ecosystem is now pushing towards a more sophisticated understanding of what cross-chain communication actually means. And how you can minimize the risk of it. So one thing that we've put forward recently is this idea that if you take this primitive, which is a messaging bridge, so of course the word bridge means a lot of things to different people, transfers of value, transfers of messages, etc. We're going to just refer to all of, like the base construction, which is a messaging bridge, which is let me get some information from one chain to another. That information could be related to a token transfer, but it doesn't actually matter. If you take a messaging bridge as a core construction, something that we've observed over the course of doing research for the past few years is really that core core primitive gets broken up into three different layers. There's transport, which is the like simple process of getting data from one chain to another and not actually making assumptions about what happens to that data. Everybody ends up building this themselves, but it's fairly simple. You're just like, it's just kind of relaying effectively. And you can use out of the box tooling for that, which is nice. You can use stuff like Biconomy, Gelato, etc. So that's something where it's a well-established layer of the stack, and there's really no risk there yet. On top of that comes, how do you actually secure the message that you've now relayed across chains? And that's the place where I think most people are getting tripped up. So historically, the way that this has happened is, some sort of multi-sig. There's now a push towards more kind of like trust minimized mechanisms, things like light clients, ZK light client implementations that allow you to do like more trustless communication between L1 chains. And then of course there's like the rollup bridges themselves, which provide L2 to L1 communication that is trustless. But again, like these are all things that are being built, right? They can still get hacked, and like all of the bridge hacks that have happened have not happened because of some trust. So far at least, they've largely happened because like someone's implementation had a bug in it. So that verification piece is where like the vast majority of the security risk lies. And then lastly, on top of all of that, you have what's called execution, which is what Connext does. Execution is after you have taken data across chains and verified that it's correct, how do you then do something with it on the destination? So like from a developer perspective, how do you call a contract on another chain? From a user perspective, how do you interact with the dApp on the destination chain? And usually any kind of application is built on top of the execution layer, because you don't, as a dApp developer or user, you don't want to have to run infrastructure to do that yourself. So again, execution not as risky, right? Again, it's more of a fairly simple thing that needs to be decentralized for censorship resistance purposes and stuff like that, but it's not inherently providing it's not contributing to what we call the surface area of risk for bridging. So let's focus all of our efforts on verification. And this is kind of the way that Connext differs from everything else. And actually I would say all of the other bridges that are live today basically just build this whole stack themselves, and then they implement their own verification layer that is used in the same way across all chains. Connext does something slightly different. What we do is we try to delegate that to whatever the best mechanism is for verification in a given ecosystem that already exists. So for example, if you're interacting with an application on Optimism, that application is relying on the Optimism rollup bridge. There is no way that you are going to get out of trusting the Optimism rollup bridge is going to work, right? Because fundamentally, if that construction fails, then the entire Optimism rollup implodes. There's nothing that anyone can do about it. So for communication that happens to and from Optimism, Connext uses the Optimism rollup bridge. We actually pass the message through the rollup bridge, and if something goes wrong, we fall back to the Optimism rollup 7-day exit window. Similarly, on Arbitrum, we use the Arbitrum rollup bridge. On Polygon, we use the Polygon POS bridge because that's the one that underlies all of the assets on that chain. And then for other systems where there isn't a canonical bridge available or isn't something that's very, very established, we're working towards using basically like an aggregated verification approach. There's been some chatter recently about this model called Hashi, which is a multi-bridge, multi kind of verification mechanism that aggregates, a bunch of different options, aggregates like wormhole, succinct, etc., to create one system where you would have to have the majority of all of those other bridges fail in order for some hack to occur. And so from our perspective, we would then delegate verification to them. We would sit on top of Hashi, be an execution layer for them, and like fully have them control security of the system. We believe that by doing this, we like Connext and in general, this space can get like a level of security that has not been seen at all so far for bridges, and really is like the end state of how you can do secure communication between chains. So in a nutshell, that is, if I'm sending a message from Arbitrum to Optimism, that is going through the Arbitrum rollup bridge to Ethereum, and then from Ethereum through the Optimism rollup bridge to Optimism. There's of course some bells and whistles on that. We batch those messages significantly to cut costs. We do certain kinds of things to like help reduce the latency of those transfers. And then we have a system that exists on top of that to execute the message on the destination chain. And in many cases, that can happen immediately. But in a nutshell, you're still kind of relying on the existing infrastructure that is already securing the space.
Yeah, very interesting to hear you kind of break down the components of a bridge and how most people build the entire stack themselves. You guys focus on the execution layer and delegate the security part, the verification part, to those who are building that natively, like Optimism on Optimism, Arbitrum on Arbitrum. And it allows you guys to focus on the fun part, which is the scalability. Like the execution is where like you can actually go and do something on that chain and not really like have to worry about the verification and the security part, because you guys are plugging in the most secure bridge that you could possibly plug in because it's the canonical bridge on that chain. How do you, like, I guess my question is more like on the latency, because does that mean like when someone bridges through Connext, they're basically, bridging through the Optimism verification client, and you guys have to wait the 7 days? Like, you mentioned there were some bells and whistles. I guess like this is probably about as technical as we could go, but like what are some of the bells and whistles you guys put in to reduce latency when going through one of those native bridges?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's actually the main thing that I think, one of the main pieces of value that we provide as an execution layer, that where we do it in a way where, again, we're trying to minimize any additional security overhead, we're minimizing any additional trust overhead compared to the underlying bridges. But of course, like, this is part of the part of the secret sauce that Connext is providing to a developer, like an application developer that wants to build a cross-chain app. So there's two things that we do. The first is what you mentioned about how do you deal with like the 7-day optimistic rollup exit. So there's kind of a couple of pieces there. So first is the 7-day window is a somewhat arbitrary. It's, and not just arbitrary, it actually represents something that's a little bit different than people think it does. A lot of people believe that the rollup, when you make a transaction on the rollup, that transaction isn't final until 7 days in the future. That's not actually true. Your transaction on a rollup finalizes as soon as the rollup operator posts the next kind of batch of transactions, so posts your transaction to Ethereum. Because at that point, you and anyone else, including people that want to dispute the rollup, can verify that the sequencer has not committed fraud. So why do you have 7 days? You have 7 days because you need to give enough time for the entirety of the rollup state to actually be posted to Ethereum. Because the rollups are all pushing for EVM equivalency right now, that actually requires interactivity. It requires you to play this game where, like, say I'm disputing the Optimism rollup, like I would need to, I'm a person that's like watching the system, has caught fraud. I would need to put forward the fraud, and then the Optimism sequencer would need to reply with some state, and then I would need to reply with more fraud, and they, and like you would have to go back and forth on that several times to get to the point where the entirety of the Optimism state is replayed on Ethereum to prove that something has gone wrong. For bridging, you don't actually need to do that. All you need to know is is there fraud in the first place? Because if there is, you can fall back to the 7-day window to adjudicate where did the fraud come from. But you don't need to wait the full amount of time to know if there, like the kind of binary thing of is there even fraud to begin with. So what Connext does is we actually shorten that window significantly. We pass the message through the rollup sequencer. So the only way that fraud can occur is if the rollup sequencer actually commits fraud in the first place, which again, you would have to assume that Optimism is actively committing fraud. Then on top of that, we wait 30 minutes. And in that 30 minutes, we have our own system of watchers that is basically checking to see if any dispute has been initiated against Optimism. Now, it stands to reason, again, because of economic incentives and because of the way that the way that Optimism works and the way that people watch the Optimism rollup, that within 30 minutes, at least someone will have initiated the dispute. Obviously, the dispute will take 7 days to finish, but within 30 minutes, has fraud occurred on chain. And so we only need to wait 30 minutes when exiting the rollup. And you can be very, very confident that can happen with a very high degree of security, because if something went wrong, in order for something to go wrong, you would need basically the Optimism sequencer, whoever is sequencing the Optimism chain at the time, to commit fraud, and for all of the Connext watchers to not notice that none of the Optimism sequencer watchers also didn't notice. And on top of that, all of that needs to be worth it to the sequencer, who is already putting up a significant amount of value to stake in order to sequence the rollup in the first place. So generally speaking, we think that that's like provides effectively the same level of security for the kinds of things that you're trying to do. And this is also like the core basis for how like cross rollup interactions, the core kind of thought process for how cross rollup interactions using a shared sequencer will work in the future. We can touch on that in a little bit, but that's a little bit more of a technical topic, but it kind of touches on the same core point. The second thing that I mentioned that we do is we do what is called fast execution. And this is a really interesting concept that we've created, and that actually makes sense cryptoeconomically. So there's this model that people have been doing for a very long time called atomic swaps. Atomic swaps is like how the OG way that people were doing interoperability. You had all these atomic swap protocols.
Shape shift.
Yeah, exactly. You had all these atomic swap protocols between like Bitcoin and Ethereum. And what you would do is you'd put up some BTC on Bitcoin into a multisig, and then I'd put up some BTC on Ethereum in a multisig, and then we would like basically I would like you would give like one of the signatures to unlock the multisig, and I would give the other one. Then we could basically atomically unlock both at the same time, so that you get your funds and I get my funds. And there's no way for only half of that to execute. What's really interesting is that the core idea is basically I'm basically letting you as a service provider, I'm letting you as a counterparty front me capital on the destination chain, right? Front the BTC to me on Bitcoin in order to then receive my ETH. And I can ensure that that happens atomically because of the mechanism that has been built underneath. That core mechanism can be generalized. It doesn't just need to be for transfers of value. You can actually do that for any instance where the counterparty, so the person who you're interacting with, any instance where the counterparty is able to call a contract on the destination chain. So let's take a little bit more material example. Say, for example, I have my funds in USDC on Arbitrum, and I want to trade USDC for ETH. I want to do it on Optimism because Optimism has the best USDC for ETH price, and it even including the gas cost of getting there, it's worthwhile to do. Now, obviously, I could bridge out of Arbitrum to Ethereum, bridge to Optimism, etc., or I could do something like bridge to Optimism and then swap on Uniswap there. But all of those things are just a bit of a pain in the ass, right? Like as a idealized user, I don't want to have to like think about any of that. I just want to go to Uniswap and use the app. So one way to do that is for me to give, say I'm swapping 100 USDC. One way for me to do that is for me to put that 100 USDC into escrow. And for me to go to Rob and say, hey, Rob, can you swap 99.5 USDC on Optimism to ETH and then send me the ETH on Optimism? And if you do that programmatically, I can basically ensure that the 100 USDC that I have locked in escrow on Arbitrum will be paid out to you. Now, in effect, what I've done is I've paid you as a service provider to just front capital for me and to do the transaction immediately. And you're willing to do that as long as you get paid back, obviously with some fees. That core concept is what we're calling fast execution. It's something that, it's like similar in concept to the fast liquidity model that a lot of people have been talking about for exiting rollups, but more generalized to any public facing function. What this means from our protocol perspective is, and this is really cool, for any user facing interaction, our network can just execute it immediately. The reason it can do that is because we have a network of off-chain liquidity providers and executors called routers. Those routers just front the capital to execute the destination chain transfer, so a Uniswap call, for example, and then they will get repaid by the protocol because there is a message that goes through the slow path going through Ethereum from Arbitrum to Optimism. And when the message arrives on Optimism, routers can basically claim against the funds that you paid them on Optimism or on Arbitrum to begin with.
And so that's like the mechanism of what effectively LPing on a Connext looks like. Those are the routers, and then the fees on what our users and what our community sees on bridges or on Connext, the fees that they have to pay, which is oftentimes higher leaving a rollup going to mainnet versus going from mainnet to a rollup, obviously outing gas fees as part of it. That fee is what you just explained as well, is that kind of fronting process, and there's risk in there, but is that right, or is that UI front facing fee separate from that kind of fee that the person who's fronting earns?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's one little nuance here, which is there's two types of liquidity providers in Connext. There's like the active liquidity provision, and they're not just providing liquidity, they're also doing a lot of like execution and stuff. So there's like basically the nodes of the network, which are routers. And what they're doing is they're charging a 5 BPS fee on any like fronting of capital that they do, which really it seems like nothing, but routers are still earning a pretty sizable amount, and we're only just getting started. So it's pretty awesome. And then it's a really efficient business, right? You're basically like locking up like liquidity for an hour and you're getting 5 BPS on it. Then your liquidity unlocks and you can lock it up again. So like you can do that, anywhere between like up to like 12 times a day or something like that. So if you have 100K in liquidity, you're basically getting 12 times 5 BPS per day in fees. And so over the course of a year, that's like, several 100% annualized. But there is another kind of liquidity provider on Connext, which is the passive liquidity. This is again a bit nuanced. The reason that passive liquidity exists in Connext is because we want to make sure that we're, as a user, you're getting the right asset. We don't want to give users like a wrapped Connext asset or something like that. So what we do is on both at the source, like when you're getting started, and then at the destination, we'll swap from like the canonical asset. So for example, Polygon POS USDC into the Connext specific asset, which is Next USDC. Next USDC is basically a pointer to USDC locked on Ethereum. So what we're basically doing is pricing your chain's liquidity against Ethereum liquidity. And then that Next USDC, of course, is controlled by Connext, so we can burn and mint it across chains. So just, I guess, Andy, to answer your question, the fees as a user that you will see will be the 5 BPS fee from a router, and then you will see some like slippage associated with those AMMs. That slippage could be positive or negative. Usually, I mean, it's a stable swap with a, which are obviously quite efficient. So like the slippage that you typically see is very low. I mean, we've done like very sizable transfers during like the USDC DPEG, for example, and like the max slippage that we saw was 0.4%.
Yeah. Yeah, it's always really, really reasonable, even with size.
Yeah.
Pretty much any chain as well. The rollups in Ethereum always have really good liquidity for sure. I mean, from my experience. So, yeah, Arjun, kind of wrapping up here. One last thing that we ask a lot of our guests as we close up is, if you had to explain Connext to one person or one entity, who would it be, and what would your quick elevator pitch be?
Yeah. Connext is a platform for cross-chain application development, right? We think every single application in this space is going to at least be interacting with users from across chains, if not be natively deployed across multiple chains. In the same way that today, as an application developer, you build a web app that interacts with resources all over the internet, you will build a cross-chain application, like cross-chain dApp, that will interact with resources all over the interchain. The way that Connext works is by delegating security to the canonical bridges of each ecosystem. So you're basically retaining the same like trust and security as the underlying rollup or underlying chain. And the goal is that by doing that, we can provide the best, most secure experience for people to build this new wave of applications that is coming.
Nice. You missed part of the question as who would you explain it to? But I'm just going to go ahead and say Elon Musk.
Oh, Elon Musk. Yeah. I mean, basically our target user is, obviously we have the end user, Bridge UI and stuff like that. But like, in my opinion, I think bridges are going to disappear completely. Like, it doesn't make sense for them to exist. It's sort of like, I don't know, it's sort of like email. Like it'll probably exist, but it's just like, eventually you're going to have chat baked into everything. And you're like, why should I use email anymore? Except for spam. And so I think our target user, the people that we really, really want to talk to, and the people that we want to interact with Connext and build on top of us, are developers, people that want to build new and interesting applications.
Sweet. Well, thanks a lot for coming on, Arjun. I really appreciate it. It was a great chat. Looking forward to see what you guys build, and also see you guys out there in Lisbon, I'm sure. And yeah, man, take it easy. Keep on building. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you guys so much for having me.
Yeah,
it was a pleasure, man.
Thanks for coming on.
Appreciate it.